In this video, you're going to learn about mocked functions, also known as spies. These are going to be another tool in our tool belt, allowing us to more completely test our code. So the goal here is to test this code highlighted. What do we have to do to get that done? First up, we have to render expense form with valid data. We already know how to do that. We have our fixtures data. We could just pick one of those items. Step 2 is to simulate the submission. We know how to do that as well. Step 3 is to make sure the state was cleared. We also know how to do that. But step 4 is a little trickier. We need to make sure that the onSubmit prop was called with this object, with the correctly formatted information. This is the thing that we don't know how to do just yet, but we are going to be able to actually get this done once we learn about spies. So what I'd like to do is create a test case and explore these mocked functions or spies in isolation. Then we'll actually integrate them by rendering expense form, and we'll figure out how we can completely test that function. Step 1, though, is to just explore this new tool. So right here, I'm going to make the test case should call onSubmit prop for valid form submission. And then we're just going to set up the actual function body. Now, the whole goal of these spies is to create these functions that are fake functions. They're created by Jest for us, and we can make assertions about them. We can check if the fake function was called. We can check if it was called 5 times. We can check if it was called with specific arguments. So to kick things off, let's explore some basic examples. Then I'll show you where in the docs you can learn more. So I'm going to kick things off by creating a const, and we are going to have this be called onSubmit spy. And in order to create a new spy, we use jest.fn. This is a function we call with no arguments. It returns the new spy. All we need to do is store it on a variable. Now that we have a spy in place, we actually have access to a brand new set of assertions. I'll show you where those live in just a moment. For now, let's just use the simplest one, which is to check that our spy was called. We don't care how many times it was called. We don't care what it was called with. We just care that it was called. So we can expect onSubmit spy. And right here, the assertion is to have been called. So this is going to throw an error if your spy was never called, and the test case would pass if it was called. If I save the program, obviously our spy was never called and we are getting an error. We expected the mock function to have been called, it wasn't, and that's why the test is failing. If I were to add a call in here to onSubmit spy, and I were to resave the test suite, this time around, the spy would be getting called and the test case would indeed pass. So at its very basics, this is what we're going to be able to do. We're going to be able to create these fake functions. We're going to be able to pass them into our components, and we're going to be able to make sure they were called as we expected them to be called. Now let's actually pull up the docs and explore all of this in a little more detail. I'm going to switch over to the browser and over to the Jest documentation, and the page we're looking for is just the regular old expect API reference, a place we've been before, and there are a few assertions that we can use with spies, and they're defined right here. So we have to have been called times, so this allows us to check if a spy was called a specific number of times. We also have to have been called with, where we can check if a spy was called with certain arguments, and to have been last called with, which is very similar to the one before it, but it just checks the last time the spy was called. And these last two, these are a little more along the lines of what we need to do. We need to make sure the spy that we pass into expense form not only was called, but was called with the correct stuff, the object with all of the formatted data. So in order to get that done, we're going to need to use these other assertions. To have been called is not going to be enough. Now we can go ahead and start messing around with them. We are going to play with to have been called with right here. We can go ahead and call our spy with a couple of arguments, maybe the string Andrew for the first one and the string Philadelphia for the second one. And now we can make an assertion that checks it was actually called with these two. I could leave this assertion in place if I wanted to, but it doesn't really make sense if I'm checking if it was called with the specific arguments. Obviously, it was called. So right here, to have been called with, we're going to expect it to have been called with first up Andrew and second up Philadelphia. If it was called with both of these arguments, great, the test case will pass. And if I head over to the terminal, that's exactly what we're going to get. If it wasn't called with these arguments, let's go ahead and mess one of them up. Maybe I will remove the second one. We can see this time around that we have a failure. We expected the mocked function to have been called with these two arguments, but in reality, it was just called with the 1. So using these spies is going to allow us to do some pretty powerful things. I'm going to be able to pass the spy into the component that we render. I'm going to be able to simulate things like the form submission and actually ensure that everything went well. So we're going to go through this process together for this particular test case. Then later on, as we test the other components, there'll be challenges in place for you to use spies on your own. So to kick things off, let's see how this is going to work. Step 1 is still going to be to create the spy. So I'm going to leave that top line in place, but I will remove the other 2. Step 2 is going to be to render expense form. I'm going to make a const wrapper. I'm going to use shallow to render the expense form component, and I am going to be rendering it with some props. First up, I want to pass in an expense, so when I submit the form, there is real valid data. I'm going to access one of the expenses from the fixtures file. We already have that imported up above, so we can just access the expenses array. And I'll just go ahead and grab the first one with the index of 0. And the other thing we need to pass in is on submit. Because remember, the component itself, it is going to call on submit, so it better be defined. Now, what are we going to set it equal to? We're going to set it equal to our spy. So right here, I'm going to pass the spy in on submit spy. Now that we have the component rendered with the spy, we can actually go through the next steps. The next one is to simulate that form submission. Now we've already gone through that process, so we can just take the code up above to simulate the form submission. I'm going to copy it from that test case and paste it down below. So now the form was submitted, and we can make some assertions about what should have happened. What should have happened? Well, the state should now equal an empty string. We can check that. And the spy should have been called with specific arguments. We can check that as well. Right here, first up, I'm going to expect. I'm going to use wrapper.state to get the error state, and I'm going to expect that to equal, using to be, an empty string. That one's easy. The next one is going to be a little trickier. So this time around, we want to expect something about the on submit spy. Now, we could use something like to have been called, and this is going to work. The test case will pass, but it's really not going to be the full featured test case we're looking for. What I really want to do is make sure it was called with the correct stuff, not just called at all. So what we need to do is actually check that what it was called with equals the object that we were hoping for. That means that we'll be switching this up to something like to have been last called with, something where we can actually make sure that the spy was not just called, but called with the correct stuff. Now in this case, we want it to be called with all of the stuff from the first expense. Now we can't just take the expense like this, expenses, with the index of 0 and pass that in. Because remember, this is going to have the ID, but over here, we don't send the ID out since this component might be used with an expense that doesn't have an ID yet because it's not actually added. So if I do save the file in its current state, we can see that discrepancy is what's causing the test case to fail. We have ID up here, we don't have it down below, they're not considered matches, so we have a problem, and we're going to go ahead and fix that by just defining the exact object. Right here, for example, we start off with description. It should equal the first expenses description. Then we move on to the next field, which could be anything. I'm going to go ahead and start with amount. We grab the first expense, and we grab its amount property. Then we have note, grabbing the first expenses note property. And the final one we're looking for is created at. I'm going to access that first expense and grab the created at field. So now we are making an assertion correctly, and if I save things, we should see a passing test case, and that is exactly what we have. Now we have a complete test case that makes sure when we have valid data, the error gets cleared, and the prop on submit gets called with the correct stuff. And this is something we wouldn't have been able to do if we hadn't used spies. Now we're going to wrap this video up with just 2 more test cases. We're going to be writing test cases for on-date change and on-focus change because these come with their own set of problems, which is figuring out how we can trigger these when they're not set up with on-submit or on-change handlers. They are actually set up by passing them down into single date picker. So we need a way to figure out how to trigger those props. That's going to make these run, and then we can write assertions making sure the state changed correctly. Now we're going to work with on date change together, and on focus change will be your challenge. Now, when it comes to testing, you're going to have to hit your own stride with exactly what you test. If you're more in the prototypey phase, you might find yourself writing less tests. If you're doing a production application with a ton of users and a lot of code, you might find yourself writing more tests. My goal in this section is to give you all of the tools you need to write as many tests as your heart desires. So yeah, I know there's not a whole lot to test here, but since it does come with its own unique set of challenges, I do want to make sure you know how to overcome those. So let's focus on testing on date change. I'm going to pass a moment instance into created@, and I'm going to expect that it gets set on the state. If we can do that, we're all done. Over here, test should set new date on date change. Then I will set up the actual test function. So the first thing that we're going to focus on doing is rendering the component as always. I'm going to create a const wrapper. I'm going to use shallow, and I'm going to render the component. Now, do we need to pass any data down? No, we really don't. So I can just render expense form as is. Now that we have expense form rendered, the next thing we want to focus on is how we can trigger the prop from that child component, from single date picker. To do this, we first have to find single date picker using wrapper dot find. We're going to call find, passing in a string, and we can actually find by component. So right here, I can just type the component name in, single date picker. That is going to find the instance, and we're going to be able to work with that, doing whatever we need to do. In this case, the goal is to get one of its props and call it. In this particular case, we are going to be getting the prop right here on date change. So to do that, we have to learn about a brand new method that Enzyme gives us. We can explore that over inside of Google Chrome. We can head back over to the Enzyme docs, and this one down below is called props. Props, or prop, let us read those prop values. I can use props to read all of them, or I can use prop with a key to just get one. And this is going to work for our purposes. We really just need to get one prop on date change. So right here, I am going to access prop. I'm going to pass in the string on date change. This is going to give us back the handler we registered, and all I'm going to do is call this with whatever data it expects to be called with. That is going to be a moment instance. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. Up at the very top of the file, I do need to import moment since it's not currently imported. Import moment from moment. Then down below, we can actually create a moment instance and pass it in. Down here, I'm going to call what comes back. This is the actual handler, and I'm going to pass in a new moment instance. I can just call it like so. I could even go ahead and break this out into a variable up above, making my assertions a little bit easier. Const now equals a new moment instance. We pass now in, and now we can actually make the assertion, checking that the state was correctly set. We already know how to do this. We are going to expect, and then I'm going to look at wrapper dot state to get an individual state value. The one we're looking for is created@. That's the one that should have changed. And we're going to expect it to equal up above the now variable. With this in place, we can go ahead and save the expense form test file. I can switch over to the terminal, and what do we get? We get a passing test suite, which means that when single date picker does fire on date change, our component is acting correctly. Your challenge to wrap this one up is going to make sure that on focus change actually sets calendar focused. Now, if you remember, this is either true or false. Up above, we started off at false. So you can go ahead and try to call it with true on that object and make sure calendar focused ends up with true. Remember, this is an object that has the focused property on it. So you're going to get all of that done in a new test case down below. You can do something along the lines of should set calendar focus on change, and then you're actually going to fill out the test case. Now, when you're done, save it, make sure it passes. If it doesn't pass, try to tweak it to get it to pass. Then you can go ahead and click play and watch me go through the process. So take a moment to pause the video, and when you're done, click play. All right, hopefully you were able to use what we learned up here to solve the problems that we're going to run into down below. I'm going to start by taking the test case name, copying it, and tossing it right into a call to test. Then I'm going to set up the function for the test case and move on to actually getting things done. Now in this case, we do want to create a focused variable, const focused. And I'm going to set this equal to true. If it starts off at false, let's set it to true to make sure it actually changes. And then we just need to shallow render our component. I can take that line from up above if we like, since it'll be the exact same thing down below. Next step, we want to find something on single date picker. We are going to do a call to wrapper.find to get that done. We're looking for single date picker. Now that we have it, we're looking for a prop on there, and this is where you need to know the actual prop name. So in this case, the prop name is on focus change. So right here, we're going to pass into prop the string on focus change, making sure we actually get that function back. Now we have to go ahead and actually call it, tossing on another set of parentheses. It's also important that we pass something in here. Now we already know that the change handler expects an object with the focused property, so that is exactly what we are going to pass in. I'm going to pass in an object with a focused property who gets its value from the variable up above. Now that we have this line in place, the last thing we need to do is make sure it was set correctly. So we need to make an assertion that confirms the calendar focused state changed. Right here, I'm going to expect wrapper dot state getting calendar focused, and I'm going to expect it to be whatever I have up above, the focused variable. Now that we have the assertion in place, we can go ahead and actually save things. It's going to run through the test suite and everything passes. Now, if neither of these actually work correctly or they're not registered correctly, we're going to get notified, making sure that the test cases fail, and we can make the necessary changes to our code to actually get things working. We now have a complete test case for expense form. And in the next videos, we're going to move on to testing the rest of our components. Let's take a quick moment to recap. In this one, we learned about spies or mocked functions. These allow us to create a little function. We can then pass it into our components or anything else, and we can make sure that when an event happens, like a form submission, it was called. It was either called a certain number of times, or called with specific data. And if you ever forget how those work, just refer over to the expect jest documentation. We also learned how we can access props off of children that our components render. This allows us to make sure that things were wired up correctly with single date picker, and it allows us to ensure that the handler actually does the correct stuff. Now that we have all of this in place, we know all of the tools to test the rest of the components. So we're going to be moving a little quicker, and I will give you more tests as challenges. Let's go ahead and continue on in the next video. I'm excited to get to that, so I'll see you then.